Welcome to Dabo Recap. Enjoy your viewing. Winter. There is chaos on the battlefield, and hundreds of corpses lie in the snow. Some died from many blows from cold weapons, many from arrows, and some from everything at once. Legend has it that in such times of chaos and disaster, a swordsman always appears and hands the right sword to the right person. A young and mysterious swordsman walks across the battlefield, passing through many corpses and talking about borrowing a sword. On his way sits a man leaning against a tree. The man sitting by the tree turned to look at the mysterious swordsman. This man was probably one of those who were lucky enough to survive this bloodbath, and he looked very shabby. The swordsman was dressed in a blue robe, wore a large hat, and had flowing long hair. This swordsman asked a guy sitting near a tree if he wanted to borrow a sword. The guy with his mouth open put his 2 hands forward, and approaching him, the swordsman extended his hand with the sword to the hands of this man, passing the sword into the hands of a battered man. The swordsman said that droughts and floods would kill the young seedlings, and then a great epidemic would begin. Huge buildings would begin to rise one by one, and villages and cities would be either destroyed or abandoned. Handing over the sword, the swordsman continued to say that prices for animals will increase many times over. Wheat costs 19 wen, and by January, it will already cost 90. People will become animals, and animals will become people. Listening to the swordsman, the beaten guy took the sword and sat on his knees. The swordsman continued by saying that the sun would hide around the corner, and the earth would fall in on itself. And the mysterious swordsman ended his story by saying that when this prophecy is fulfilled, he will return to reclaim the sword that he had just given away. After these words, he turned around and walked away until he went beyond the horizon line. The man who received the sword never moved from his place. He sat on his knees and held the received sword. A large city built among the rocks. Winter had passed and the weather was good outside. At the entrance to the city there was a stone on which it was written that this was a school of swordsmen. A tall, huge 7-story building with wide steps, painted red and white. The young man climbs the stairs to enter it. The guy was wearing turquoise and white clothes. He had very long hair, and he was carrying something behind his back. Climbing the long steps, the guy went inside the building. The doors were huge and high, as if made for some giants. Inside the building, a very large sword was inserted into the ground. It was 30 times larger than an ordinary person. The sword was bound with chains, and some kind of blue energy was splashing out at the bottom of it. The young man took some kind of stone that was on his back and placed it in front of this huge sword. Having made strange movements with the fingers of his right hand, the young man spoke words to me and raised his hand up. Some kind of orange or golden aura oozed around him. At that moment, a huge variety of different swords began to fly towards the guy. In the air, and around each sword, there was the aura of a young man. Having opened his stone in half, all the swords that were in the air flew inside it. After waiting for all the weapons to fly inside, the guy closed this stone, which was apparently used for storage. The aura that was everywhere disappeared too. The guy was standing and holding his accessory when he felt something approaching from behind him. It was a huge golden sword, which the young man caught between 2 fingers and stopped. The guy turned his head back and looked in the direction from which the sword flew, and also began to carefully look at one point. At the entrance to the building stood an old man, dressed in expensive-looking clothes, with a long gray beard, smoking a pipe. He smiled and laughed. Addressing the young man as the little Tang Dao, the old man asked if the guy was preparing to come down from the mountain and distribute swords, to which the young man threw that same golden sword back and said that this sword was given to the supreme ruler by the teacher, and that is, an old man. Jumping onto that same huge sword and pushing off from it, Tang Dao sat on a high beam that was almost to the ceiling. The young man told the teacher to take care of this himself. The teacher sent the sword back to Tang Dao, and laughingly said that he had already decided to transfer this task to him. Jumping away from the beam, the guy said in a dissatisfied voice that he and his swords were not for the people from the southeast, and then said goodbye and asked not to involve him in the old man's tasks. Bouncing off one of the beams, the guy felt his vault on his back open. He was surprised. Turning his head back, the guy saw that the sword that he had sent to the teacher was flying towards his back. The sword flew into the open stone, and the evil Tang Dao turned to the old man to scream. Addressing the mentor as a grandfather, he said that dumping your tasks on others is against the rules of the school. The teacher, jumping in the other direction with a grin, said that he was the head of the school, and he did not think that this was against the rules of the school. Sighing deeply, the young man resigned himself to his task and heard from his mentor that the ruler to whom he needed to give the sword was a corrupt glutton. When Tang Dao walked down the steps, the teacher shouted after him that he could have a lot of fun this time. But the guy's face only showed reluctance to complete the task. A huge pool with a bunch of girls, a tall muscular man was hanging out there, and there was plenty of food around him and the girls. Giggling, the girls addressed the man as Your Majesty and offered various food and drinks. A huge man holding the girls close to him tried their treats, and they tried to find out if he liked it. The man liked everything, and therefore he praised the girls, saying that they were both good, to which one of the girls kissed him on the cheek. Suddenly someone entered. The man became wary and did not take his eyes off the entrance. He looked very carefully. At the entrance stood the mysterious Tang Dao with his vault behind him, merging with the terrain. It seemed as if he had appeared out of nowhere. The young man took the case from his back and took it in his hands, and also approached the water in which the ruler was resting. The guy wiped the sweat from his forehead and said that he had finally found what a man who was next to the ruler shouted and called the guards. Tang Dao from different directions from bows and crossbows. Opening his case, the guy made it in the shape of a cross and hit absolutely every arrow. Tang Dao looked down at the broken arrows that were lying on the floor and looked at his case, saying that it was a bit heavy. A huge number of people with firearms stood in a row in front of the poor young man. Having called the task a hassle, the guy understood why the teacher did not want to come here and stopped in front of the crowd of guards. Tang Dao asked them to wait, and said that he was a swordsman, and also added that he had come to lend a sword to His Majesty. They called the young man an impudent man and said that the whole world already belongs to the ruler, and they also added that he owns everything in this world. Making a menacing face, the ruler asked how the guy dared to lend him something and ordered the guards to kill Tang Dao. The guards began to carry out their orders. They loaded their weapons and began firing at the poor swordsman. Taking a deep breath, the guy began to open his sword case and continued to remain calm. Tang Dao took out his sword and began to deflect every projectile that flew at him. The young man stood still and deflected absolutely every projectile with swings of his sword. In addition to this, he not only deflected the bullets, but also cut them in half. The guards were shocked by what they saw, and everyone froze in shock. They say that he fought off all the shells, and something was wrong with his sword. The guards calmed down and began to push the guns towards the guy, saying that no matter what he was, it was just a sword, and he was not standing next to their guns. The guards began to aim their cannons at Tang Dao, and the young man himself prepared and took a stance. The commander-in-chief ordered the guards to shoot, and at that moment shells flew at the young man. There was an explosion. In the place where the explosion occurred, everything fell, and a lot of dust rose around. The soldiers looked and did not see Tang Dao, and therefore decided that he had died. The smoke began to fall, and in that very place, the silhouette of a young man began to appear. He recalled that he had already said that he was not a murderer. The guards were shocked. They couldn't believe his eyes and stared at the guy with open mouths. On the young, there was no man, neither scratches, and his clothes was fully intact. Lowering his sword and making a serious face, he said that he was a swordsman. The guards could not calm down. The commander-in-chief began to shout that the guards would not stop and continue shooting. Tang Dao said that the guards were too much trouble and decided to make them fall asleep. His sword began to light up with a purple glow. Raising the sword, a purple aura appeared around the sword, and the young man and the guy called the technique itself Purple Sparks. The young man pointed the sword forward. The blade looked at his opponents and purple particles rushed forward. What did this technique do? As you might have already guessed from Tang Dao's intentions, everyone around fell asleep. The only one who did not fall asleep was the ruler himself, who was sitting in his pool. Holding the sleeping girl in his arms, the ruler became even more wary, but so far did not utter a word. The young man took the case from his back and began to slowly approach the ruler, dragging a huge case along the floor. Having come as close as possible, the guy stopped and appeared before the ruler holding his vault in his left hand. Placing the case in front of him, the guy began to cast a spell that said that Pangu would rise, Hundun would fall, and after the storm, Nuwa would sit on a stone. A sword began to peek out of the case, which was exactly reflected in the eyes of the 13th student of the Menic school, Tang Dao. Continuing his words, the guy said that the woman would be lured into a trap, closely monitoring the affairs of the sovereign, and the school of swordsmen would stand and carry out the harvest. When the sword came out almost completely, the guy said that, on the orders of the mentor, he was handing over the sword to Jinglo. The sword began to fly towards the ruler. Then he jumped in fear and threw the girl who was sleeping in his arms. And Tang Dao himself continued that he was handing over the sword to a representative of the Luo-Jin dynasty Tianyanyu. The sword flew next to the ruler and cut one of his hands. The young man looked at this spectacle without moving, when the ruler himself did not understand what was happening. Using the ruler's blood, the sword became covered with a dark green aura and presented a frame with some text in front of it. This was a prophecy with which it was said that the winged dragon would become bogged down in feasts and dishes, and the 5 ranks of the nobility would touch the scales against the pile. Then the golden scales would awaken from powerful dreams. The red scales would dispel the disappointed people. The yellow one will create puppets behind the scenes. The black one will dispose of the gold. Greed will become the source of trouble. The prophecy continued that the blue scales would stretch out the veins of the winged dragon, and chaos would ensue in the palace, and then the bedchamber would become a crypt, and everything would go to waste. Reading the prophecy, Tang Dao himself was shocked by such a dangerous prophecy. The slightly angry young man realized that it looked like he really would have to intervene, and also remembered his laughing old man who had entrusted him with the task. Reading the prophecy, the man delved into the essence of these words. He thought about every word about how the bedchamber would become a crypt, or everything would go to dust. The man instantly became very serious and waved his hand. The sword took off and flew towards him. Catching his sword and pointing it at Tang Dao, the ruler called him an arrogant traitor and was very angry. All this time the guy did nothing and didn't even move, and the man was already running towards him with loud screams. Then some pinkish smoke began to dissipate around the guy, and the young man himself said that when the prophecy came true, he would return to take payment for the sword. At that moment, the young man disappeared, and the ruler hit the air with a strong wave. Everyone around was also sleeping. The ruler was very angry. Veins even popped out on his face from anger, and the man himself shouted a curse after the disappeared guy. The young man was reading a book in which it was written that one can say about the path, but that is not the eternal path. A name can be named, but that is not the eternal name. That does not yet have a name. Then the beginning of all things, and then already has a name, then the mother of all things. With great involvement, Tang Dao continued to read the book. It was written there that by turning to the fullness of the absent, you comprehend its source. By turning to the fullness of the revealed, you comprehend its outcome. The young man was very attractive, and therefore all the girls who looked at him were immediately embarrassed. Tang Dao drove up to the huge gates at which the guard stood, and still continued to read his book, in which this time it was written that the hidden is still hidden. Here is the gate of countless miracles. Having entered the city, the guy rode past the counters on his horse. The most interesting thing is that the whole trip the guy did not change his position, and he also did not sit in the usual position for a rider. Finally, the guy looked away from his book and paid attention to the streets. He suspected something. Looking at the people on the street, the young man thought that the city was full of officials and military men. Continuing to look at the streets, the guy added that despite all this, there are still many people in the city on the verge of death. Bookstore, a fairly young guy is reading a novel called Plum Blossoms in a Golden Vase and is embarrassed. Sitting on the floor next to one of the bookshelves, the guy reads every line, trembles with interest, and laughs quietly funny. They abruptly snatched the book from his hands and forced him to get out of there, and the young man himself was indignant and said that he stopped at the most interesting thing, and also asked to give the book back. Tang Dao drove past the entrance to the shop and heard all the screams that came from the entrance. Stretching out his hand to the book, the guy wanted to take it, to which the short guy who took it away shouted that if the owner found out, he would get it again. The guy made a sour face, sat down at the counter, and, putting his hand in his inner pocket, he asked how much this book cost and offered to buy it. The young man was dressed in a brown robe. He had not very long gray-white hair and very pronounced green eyes. Poking his finger at the young man, the seller said that the owner said to sell their books only to nobles, and he called the guy a stinker and said that he was unworthy. This clearly made the young man make a dissatisfied face and get a little angry. The guy tensed up very much, to such an extent that veins began to appear on his face, and the young man himself hit his palm with his fist and asked again what he had just been told. Grabbing the guy's hand, an adult man who came up from behind asked if he wanted to get himself in trouble, and the seller called the man the owner. The young man began to be indignant and say that the seller himself was the first to humiliate him, and the seller himself only stood and smiled in the young man's face, sticking out his tongue and teasing him. Then the owner stepped back a little and showed 3 healthy men who were standing behind him. The men asked how the seller had offended the young man, and the guy himself got scared and wondered where some merchant got so many muscle men from. During this dispute, Tang Dao stood not far from the place of the dispute and looked at various books. The owner told the young man that he was a commoner and would never be able to get a government post, and therefore why did he need books? The dissatisfied owner ordered the guy to leave and added that he was only dirtying his books. The guy's face was very unhappy. He stood and didn't answer, although it was clear that it hurt him very much. The young man stood and did not move. There was darkness on his face. He clenched his fists and stood silently, doing nothing. The guy calmed down and exhaled calmly. There was no longer any anger or darkness on his face. Waving his arms, he turned around and walked towards the exit, saying that the owner was an educated man, and he should behave in a more mannered manner. But this time the young man did not want to argue with them. Going out into the street, the guy began to rejoice, because he received the money and took the book, and also mentally thanked the owner for the fact that he would have something to drink. After some time, the guy fell asleep in a tree behind his most interesting book, and a boy and a girl were walking under him. The young man woke up and looked down, after which he began to listen to their conversation. The girl called the boy brother and asked him not to go, because his illness could no longer be delayed, and the boy said that he was fine, and it didn't matter how he got this lingzi today. The young man called them by name and asked where they were going. The boy's name was Yeluo, and the girl's name was Yeshen. Yeluo remained silent. He looked very shabby, walked in rags, and was holding some kind of large stick in his hand. His sister asked him to wait a little. The girl turned to our hero and called him by name. The young man's name was Shu Yu. Yeshen asked him to explain something to his brother. The tearful girl continued and said that the doctor said that only lingzi could cure her illness, but the pharmacist, seeing that they were commoners, refused to sell them anything. Having pretended to be more serious, our hero realized that the doctor had also beaten Yeluo, to which the girl confirmed the guy's words. Continuing to read his book, Shu Yu said that in this way, the boy would not achieve anything, and he would only be beaten more, to which the enraged boy said that he didn't care, and would go even if he had to steal it. Yeluo added that he was ready to fight to the death. With a heavy sigh, our young man said that if the boy dies, he will not be able to do anything. Shu Yu asked Yeluo to be patient and said that later he would gather everyone and come up with something. Yeluo became even more angry. He hit the ground with his stick as hard as he could and said that he had already endured enough. The young brother had tears in his eyes and shouted at the top of his voice that if he continues to endure it, then Xiao Shen might die. The tearful girl and the surprised Shu Yu looked at the boy with a surprised and sad face. Our hero realized that he couldn't hesitate, and so he closed his book and jumped from the tree. The surprised brother and sister asked where he was going, and he replied that he'd better go himself. Shu Yu jumped from the tree and began to take out something, and Yeluo began to look at him carefully, not understanding what he was doing. Our hero changed from his shabby old clothes into beautiful and expensive clothes like those of officials. Yeluo asked if these clothes would help our hero. Shu Yu was serious. He put on his hat, made a serious look, and said that Yeluo should not worry, because the pharmacist himself would obediently lay out the lingzi, and added that he would not even have to pay. The boy and girl began to question the young man about where he got the official's clothes, and Shu Yu said that the other day one employee left all his clothes on the shore before jumping into the river. Our hero praised this man because he decided to commit suicide by taking off all his clothes. A perplexed Yeluo corrected him and said that he just wanted to swim. The girl also asked what would happen if Shu Yu got caught, because those who pretend to be officials are imprisoned, and Yeluo asked to do everything himself. Shu Yu responded extremely negatively to the boy's request, and said that he had just been beaten, and if he went, then he would definitely be in trouble. However, Shu Yu, who was walking forward, took his brother by the shoulder and said that there is no need to carry everything alone. Otherwise, what else would he need a brother for? Shu Yu looked with the eyes of a little boy who was being harnessed by his older brother. He was happy, surprised, and sad at the same time. But in his eyes, one could read gratitude to Shu Yu. Plunging into memories, our hero asked the guys to remember and not forget how they spent time together. A bunch of guys performed an ancient Chinese ritual. In order to cement themselves as brothers, they added their blood to the wine and drank it together. As he left, Shu Yu said with his head held high, so that the guys would wait for him at this place. Yeluo still couldn't get over the shock. He looked at Shu Yu's back and called him brother. The guy did nothing else. City market, there is a stall with meat, and next to it there are signs on which tofu and meat are written. Behind the counter sat a bored guy who was yawning because he had nothing to do. He had dark long hair and some kind of chain on his chest. Shu Yu approached the butcher's shop and knocked. When the guy was noticed, he asked for his butcher's knife, to which the surprised butcher asked where our hero was. The butcher said that he had almost sold all of Shu Yu's tofu and gave him his money, and he asked the guy to buy him a drink in the evening. Noticing what Shu Yu was wearing, the butcher grabbed him by the collar and began to admire the coolness of this clothing, and also asked him to try it on, to which our hero asked him to calm him down. The young man asked the butcher for a knife, and said that he needed to run errands. The cheerful butcher grabbed 2 knives, was delighted, and said that he would also go to the thief. The guy decided to calm him down and said that the knife was just for self-defense and began to turn around to leave. Our hero hid the knife under his robe behind his back and began to move away from the shop. The butcher, holding another knife in his hand, shouted after him that if a fight broke out, so that he would not forget to call him. Shu Yu said he would call. The guy approached the pharmacist's shop and began to observe a rather cruel and interesting picture. The girl asked to wrap cold medicine, for which she was asked for identification. She said that she had forgotten, but they did not believe her, and said that if she forgot, she was a commoner, and they also added that this place was not for people like her. The girl began to say that she had money, and her mother had a fever, and if she was not cured, she could die, to which the pharmacist replied that he had nothing to do with it and began to drive the girl away. The girl, crying from her grief and holding a bag of money in her hands, began to beg and say that she would do anything. Grabbing the girl by the hands, the pharmacist asked if she was ready for anything and began to paw the girl. They say so that she would not scream and let herself be touched. The man groped the girl, grabbing her hands. The girl did not know what to do. She cried and tried to resist, but in her heart she understood that she really needed medicine. Then from behind, someone put a hand on the girl's shoulder and began to move her behind her back. Who was there? It was our noble hero. He stood in front of the girl and menacingly began to look the pharmacist in the eyes, to which the stunned pharmacist addressed Shu Yu as a master. Laughing awkwardly, the pharmacist decided to tone down and explain that this girl was just a commoner, and offered to send her out so that she would not be an eyesore to the guy. The guy got even angrier, and thought in his head that he apparently hadn't done enough, because the pharmacist still wouldn't calm down. Hitting the man in the face with his palm, Shu Yu asked how he dares to teach him. In his gaze there was only anger and hostility towards the man. The blow was quite strong. A large red mark from the blow remained on the doctor's face, and the man himself said that he did not dare teach him. The doctor a kick in the ass. He forced him to carry the medicine faster and asked if he was ready for the consequences. If the guy's illness worsened, the pharmacist stumbled and ran to the medicine. They said that he would bring it now, and the girl standing behind Shu Yu even giggled a little. Screams were heard from the shop. The pharmacist asked Shu Yu for a prescription, but the guy himself said that he needed the best lingji and several cold medicines, and also hurried the pharmacist. Having packed everything, the man handed the guy his order, saying that everything was already packed and ready. The dissatisfied young man took his order and asked how much it would cost, to which the concerned pharmacist said that their owner asked them to tell him that it was a gift. The guy cleared his throat into his hand and said that it wasn't bad. He calmed down and no longer looked like an angry official. Leading the girl behind him, the guy smiled as he left the pharmacist's shop, and also stuffed his medicines into his inner pocket. As a girl and a guy were walking down the street, Mr. Wang noticed how Shu Yu smelled like bean squeezes and walked past. Approaching the pharmacist, Van asked why he was so polite to the commoner. Why did the apothecary said that their master ordered them to be quiet and lower than the grass if they meet employees? Sighing heavily, the man told the pharmacist that this was an ordinary commoner who sells tofu, to which the perplexed pharmacist asked not to joke like that and asked whether a normal person would risk dressing up as an official. Van continued that this guy is not a normal person at all, and he often steals with his bad crowd. The man forced the pharmacist to notice how big the guy's clothes were, and that it was obvious that he had stolen them from someone. The pharmacist was terribly furious. Terrible screams were heard from the pharmacy that the guy had fooled the pharmacist by the nose, taken the best lingzi and cold medicine, and also beat him. Having reached the gate, our hero gives cold medicine to the girl and tells her to run away quickly, to which the girl thanks him and bows. Looking at the running away girl, the guy thought that an official would not care about the problems of commoners. Just as he was about to leave, the guy turned his head back and saw an evil pharmacist who was screaming and running at him, saying that he would return the lingzi to him. The surprised guy opened his mouth in surprise as the pharmacist saw through him so quickly and began to run away. The pharmacist shouted for him to stop immediately and run after him. The doctor could not catch up with the young man and simply shouted after him to stop, but Shu Yu accelerated even faster and ran away. Ye Luo comes out in the man's path with his huge stick and blocks the pharmacist's path. The guys missed each other, and Ye Luo himself said that Shu Yu would run away to Xiaoshen, who was further at the crossroads. The young man asked his brother to be more careful, and said that he had the lingzi. Having blocked the blow of the stick, the pharmacist shouted that they were at the same time, and was even more angry. Taking the stick away from the boy, the pharmacist hit him in the face so hard that he immediately fell. Poking Ye Luo's face into the ground and pressing his head with his foot, the pharmacist said that Shu Yu would immediately return the lingzi, otherwise he would unscrew the boy's legs. The beaten guy raised his head and looked at the pharmacist, shouting that he should die, and the even more angry pharmacist asked if he wanted to live and began to swing his stick. At this moment, our hero appears, beats the pharmacist and tells him to get out of this place. The unconscious man falls face down into the ground, and Ye Luo asked the young man why he returned, to which Shu Yu said that if he had not returned, the boy would have been beaten to death. The pharmacist woke up when the owner and his subordinates approached him. The owner asked where the lingzi was, to which the pharmacist said that it was still with the commoners. The enraged owner said that if the employees found out about this, then he would be finished and ordered to quickly take away the lingzi. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Shu Yu appears in public, takes one of the pharmacy owner's subordinates hostage. The young man puts a knife to the man's throat and says that they should just try to take away the lingzi. Everyone was scared. The owner, who was probably no less scared than the hostage himself, invited the guy to talk, saying that there was no need for either of them. The guy said that this mushroom is very important to them and they are ready to pay, but the owner said that the guy himself understands that it's not about the money. The owner continued to say that purple lingji is a very expensive medicine, and according to the rules, they cannot sell it to someone without a certificate. While Shuyu was distracted by the dialogue behind him, 3 men grabbed Yeluo and said that if he did not let go of the noble old man, they would beat his friend, because nothing would happen to them for this. Then the young man tensed with all his might and made a light cut on the neck of his hostage. A little blood appeared on his neck. The guy added that if they touched Yeluo again, he would immediately kill their friend. The people froze in shock, and the guy's sister tried to get through to the crowd to see what happened there. The audience condemned the guy, saying that he was too young and they didn't give him a beating. The girl, holding that same mushroom in her hands, ran into the center of the circle and shouted so that the nobles would not beat her brother. She ran up to her brother and began to hug him, and the surprised brother asked why she had come and told her to run away faster. The girl handed the package with the mushroom to the owner and asked him to let the guys go, and the tearful and surprised Yeluo began to say that she was a fool and that this medicine would save her life. Xiaoshen hugged Yeluo and said that they didn't need Lingji and they could handle it themselves. The girl reminded that their father died last year, and their mother passed away a few months ago. The tearful girl said that if she also lost her brother, she would not be able to continue living alone. Holding a bundle with a mushroom in his hands, the owner sighed with calmness, hoping that there should be no punishment. At that moment, not far from the pandemonium, a group of employees was passing by, who were surprised by such a crowd and decided to see what was happening there. The crowd saw the young people and began to run away sharply so that they would not be arrested, and that guy was called Doomed. In a huge crowd, the owner asked Shuyu to release the hostage in exchange for him forgetting about the cold medicine. The young man was surprised where the employees were from, but he also understood that if he missed the chance to get medicine now, then it would be very difficult later. Looking around, the guy realized that there were a lot of commoners in this place. Making a face like a pitiful kitten, the guy said that his sister urgently needed Lingzi, otherwise she would die, and the guy also began to play on pity and say that the owner, being a doctor, wouldn't save the dying man. The guy's emerald eyes sparkled like a little boy's, and he began his speech about how even though they are commoners, they are also people. The owner was in an awkward position, and the guy continued his speech about how isn't it natural to go to the doctor for medicine if you're sick, or isn't there money somehow? The whole crowd began to support the guy a little bit. Soon after the guy's speech, a noise arose. All the commoners began to shout and ask why they were so despised, and they called the pharmacists murderers. The crowd rejoiced and forced the owner to give up the mushroom. The pharmacist did not know what to do because in essence he was also not to blame and simply followed the laws of Yuan Ming. Our hero was waiting for this. In order to catch the owner in a mistake, the guy said that when Yuan Ming entered the central plain and became the ruler, holding a knife to one of the pharmacist's subordinates, Shu Yu continued to say that their ancestors refused to give up, and therefore became commoners and slaves. The crowd supported the guy and everyone began shouting with one voice that it was not their fault. Why should they endure this, despite the fact that those who capitulated became noble, and they are a firm and unbending people? A fight broke out. The commoners began to beat the nobles and say that they were just descendants of weaklings who had no right to throw mud at the commoners. This was all one huge plan of our hero. He hoped that the fight would be long and the employees would be drawn into it, and in this chaos he himself would be able to steal the Lingzi. A detachment of employees almost approached the fight. They turned to the commoners as if they were dogs and asked if they were tired of living. Before them was a huge mess, in which employees and commoners participated, each defending their pride and their rights. Flexing his fists, the guy in front, who apparently was the captain of this detachment, said that these dogs would remember that everyone they grab will receive 100 blows with a stick. After these words, everyone was blown away by the wind. Only our hero, brother, sister, and pharmacist remained from a huge pile of people. Shu Yu was very surprised, because everyone said that they were firm and unbending. The captain of the detachment said that for a lie, 50 blows with a stick. For insubordination and starting a riot, another 100 blows with a stick. Approaching closer and closer to our hero, the man continued to say that stealing an official uniform is 5 years in prison, and impersonating an official is 10 years in prison. His subordinates stood behind him, and one of them recognized Shu Yu, who stole his clothes. Approaching even closer, the noble smiled, pointed at the guy with his index finger, and said that it was better to execute him right away. Everyone who was at the same time with our hero was dumbfounded. Shu Yu did not know what to do. He stood as if petrified. The warriors began to draw their katanas and come closer and closer to the young man. The guy became even more wary. The frightened guy shouted that the nobles would not come up, or he would really kill the hostage. And the hostage himself, already scared to death, screamed and begged his master to save him. Calming the guy, the captain began to come even closer and say that they had come just to solve this problem. At this moment, the captain suddenly makes a dash towards the guy with the hostage and inserts his sword directly into the hostage's chest. And then, with all the stupidity, he throws him away with a kick in order to pull out his sword. The whole sword was covered in blood, and it flowed like a fountain from the wounded man. Most likely, he will not live after that. The captain began to rejoice and say that Shu Yu no longer had a hostage, and hadn't he found an excellent solution to the problem, and also praised himself for his intelligence and resourcefulness. Yeluo looked to the side and saw one of the soldiers swinging at our hero while he was still in shock after killing the hostage. Yeluo said that his brother would be careful and covered Shu Yu with his back from the sword strike. The smiling guy fell unconscious and looked at his brother. Our hero was even more shocked. Their sister began to run towards the falling body of the guy, screaming loudly and calling out to him. At some point, our hero may have suffered mental trauma. Not a single positive motive could be read on his face. His emerald eyes glowed like the eyes of a snake, and he himself was incredibly angry. Gathering all his spirit and all his anger into a fist, the guy stabbed the man who had just cut his brother with a butcher's knife and cut off the man's hand. Our hero turned on some kind of instinct of the beast, and began, as it were, a hunt for the nobles. Behind him sat his sister holding the body of her brother, and in front of him was the captain of the detachment yelling that they would cut Shu Yu and throw him into a garbage pit. In front of them stood the same butcher from the shop who asked to invite him to a fight. He shouted with a joyful face that he knew there would be a fight. Raising his axe, the butcher praised himself and said that it was good that he called his brothers. The blacksmith, the scavenger, and the corpse catcher were with him. Yu was also fighting with the employees in front. Anger appeared on the butcher's face, even hatred towards the enemies for what they had done to his brother, and so he called them scum and shouted that they must avenge their brother, the boatman. A crowd of armed commoners shouted that they would kill them and rushed into battle with hatred on their faces, and the soldiers began to ask their captain to retreat. The employees began to quickly retreat, and a crowd of townspeople ran after them and shouted for them to stop immediately. Meanwhile, Yeluo was lying on the ground and bleeding all this time. The poor girl tried to stop her, but the wound was too big and deep. Our tearful hero ran up to his brother and sister and shouted that he had the strength to stop the bleeding, pressing the wound with his hands. The guy's face no longer showed that anger and hatred. All the anger was replaced by sadness, disappointment, and longing for his brother. Our hero sat over his brother's body and cried. Unfortunately, no matter how hard the girl and our hero tried, they could not stop the bleeding, and Yeluo was dying. He was a hero in this battle. Meanwhile, behind the crowd of commoners with weapons, a crowd of patrolmen was already running on the other side, and the guys themselves were shouting to each other to run faster. Turning to Shu Yu, who was sitting near the corpses, the butcher said that they were being chased by a crowd of patrolmen, and they needed to leave quickly. Throwing his brother on his back, he said that he would take him to the doctor, and Yeluo himself said that they would leave him, take his sister, and run away. Covering his brother's mouth, Shu Yu told the girl to run to the shopping street, find a place there, and hide. The tear-stained girl, covered in her brother's blood, listened to our hero, nodded her head, and hooted. The girl ran towards the shops, and the guy himself sighed and said that the main goal of the employees was him, and he went straight. A crowd of angry soldiers ran out into the street where our hero was, and pointing a finger at him, ran after him. The bleeding guy said that Shu Yu would leave him because he was a burden, but Shu Yu himself did not listen and said that there was very little left before the doctor. A man looked out from around the corner, waved his hand at our hero and called him to him. It was Shu Yuya's father, and the surprised, tired, and excited guy asked what the man was doing there. With great surprise in his eyes, the father saw his son dragging his half-dead brother, and said that everyone in the city was only talking about how Shu Yu injured the policeman. The guy said that he was not guilty of anything, and his father believed him. His father also asked what happened to Yeluo, to which Shu Yu said that he had lost a lot of blood. Throwing his brother onto his father's back, Shu Yu said that his father would take him to Dr. Li, and the guy himself would go and distract them. Turning to his son, the father called him a brat and asked him to be careful, to which the guy nodded his head and ran on. Running around the corner, the young man stumbles upon those very soldiers, and calling them puppies, says that he is right here in front of them. Coming closer, the guy began to tease them, and say that if they wanted to catch him, then let them catch him right now, to which the angry captain shouted and ordered to grab him. A huge crowd of policemen with swords ran after one boy and could not catch up with him. Meanwhile, our tired hero ran into the forest. There was no longer a living place on him, but he still continued to run and did not give up. Suddenly, the young man suddenly braked and stopped. There was something ahead that prevented him from running further. What was it? In front of the guy, there was a cliff. The rock ended at the most inopportune moment. Below, there was water and a bunch of stones. Hearing some strange sounds behind him, the guy turned around and he was very shocked. The damned policemen had already caught up with him and were getting closer and closer every second. The guy swallowed his saliva and stopped. He didn't know what to do, He had a bunch of different ideas in his head, but he didn't know what to choose. Standing at the edge of the cliff, he began to argue that there was water below, and he should not break. Bounce. The guy in the sky looked like a bird, but he was rapidly losing height and falling into the water. Everyone who was at that moment in that place and watched all this could not believe their eyes. How such a young guy dared to jump from a huge cliff. It is clear that none of the warriors began to jump after him. Plop! The guy fell into the water at great speed. What happened next, and did he survive? Shu Yu still survived and swam out from under the water. The guards from above began to shout that he was alive, and the captain also added that the guy had better voluntarily appear in court, otherwise his family would be in trouble. To which the guy, shouting from the water, said that if they touch the father, he will get them out of the ground. The almost exhausted young man swam to the shore and leaned on it. A little more and he would have died, but our hero did not give up, and therefore got out of a difficult situation. When Shu Yu got out of the water, he did not rest, but rose to his feet, and without even shaking off the water, walked forward. Probably everyone might wonder how our hero can still walk. But let me tell you, after taking a few steps forward, the guy stumbled and fell, burying his face in the ground. It seems he was already lying unconscious, because he clearly had no strength left. The day had turned out to be too eventful. A young man in blue clothes was walking towards the guy. He walked slowly and leisurely. It was Tang Dao, who stood in front of the guy's body with his horse, and looked intently at the lying young man. The guy put his case on the ground, sat on it like a bench, and began to poke a stick into the face of Shu Yuin, who was lying unconscious. Realizing that this would not work, Tang Dao began to hit the young man in the face, trying to bring him to his senses. Shu Yu came to his senses and did not understand what was happening and where he was. In the twilight, he lay and looked at the guy who woke him up. Tang Dao brought his face closer to address the guy, but before he could do so, the young man jumped up. Shu Yu screamed and instantly woke up, waving his hand away from the guy who was sitting next to him. Turning his attention to Tang Dao, Shu Yu, I saw him sitting in his strange position on a horse and reading his book. Touching his beaten face, the guy asked who this guy was who was sitting on the horse. Tang Dao introduced himself as a swordsman and said that his goal was that he wanted to lend the young man a sword. The joyful guy ran up to Tang Dao and asked if he would have to pay for the sword, hoping of course that he wouldn't. The guy scratched the back of his head, became embarrassed and said that private resale of weapons was illegal, and asked if he really wanted to give him the sword. Tang Dao turned away from his reading and began to explain to the guy that they are swordsmen. They sell predictions. When they borrow a sword, they leave a prophecy, and when it comes true, they come to take payment. The guy made a strange grin and started asking stupid questions, and then asked how many swords he had and added that he needed them all. Turning away from Tang Dao, Shu Yu began to run in the other direction and asked the guy not to go anywhere. He added that he would call his brothers so that they could also borrow. Tang Dao stopped the young man and said that if someone is connected with the sword, he will find him himself, to which Shu Yu stopped and mumbled that the guy was a bore. Pulling a smile from ear to ear, the young man asked to give him the sharpest sword so that he could cut iron like butter. Tang Dao approached the guy and said that everything depends on Shu Yu's connection with the sword, and the young man himself said displeasedly that this infuriates him. The guy placed the sword case in front of him. The young man didn't know what Tang Dao was going to do now. While reading the spell, the guy uttered the words that Pangu will resurrect, Hundun will fall, and after the storm, Nyua will sit on a stone. The guy continued to say that the woman would be lured into a trap by closely monitoring the affairs of the sovereign. But the School of Swordsmen would stand and carry out the harvest, and also added that he was the 13th student of the School of Swordsmen, Tang Dao, on the orders of the mentor, after which the case opened, dispelling there is a purple glow around. The young man stood and did not understand what was happening. He saw such a sight for the first time, and Tang Dao said that he was handing over the sword to Mujang. The surprised guy saw a huge red sword come out, which he immediately recognized as the young man. Continuing to look at this sight, Tang Dao added that this was very, very unusual. This huge sword was flying towards Shu Yu, and out of not knowing what to do, he reflexively began to cover his face and head with his hands. The sword flew straight into the young man's hands, and he caught it and began to hold it tightly. Involuntarily, Shu Yu was already standing and holding the sword he had just received with the correct grip. The entire sky instantly turned red and red lightning began to shoot from there. Tang Dao was in a little shock. The guy stood and barely restrained the power of this powerful sword, but it was clear that he could not cope completely. The young man stood in complete shock and did not understand why the sky turned red, why these lightning strikes, and what he should do. The swordsman decided to take control of everything and pulled his hand towards the hilt of this huge red sword. Snatching the sword from his hands, Tang Dao again hid the sword in his case. After the sword was hidden, the weather instantly returned to normal and the red sky disappeared. and the blue sky and bright warm sun that were familiar to the heroes appeared. Our hero, enthusiastically rejoicing at his new sword, began to ask whether everything that had just happened was because of his sword, to which Tang Dao answered in a calm voice that Qi's abilities, the xiaos are too big, and if the young man takes the sword right now, he won't last even 3 days. Tang Dao threw our hero a wooden sword, on which not even all the foliage had been removed, and said that it was his sword. Our hero began to be indignant about why his sword was wooden, and not even all the leaves were torn off. The swordsman said that the name of this sword is Mu Zheng, and it is made from the very heart of the longevity tree. Indignantly, the young man began to wave his sword and beat the air, and also say that no matter how you look at it, it is impossible to injure someone with a wooden sword. Tang Dao snatched the sword from the young man's hands with one quick and light wave of his hand and sighed calmly. He raised his sword, and a strange purple aura began to appear around the blade of the wooden sword. Without showing any emotion on his face, the swordsman swung his sword, hitting something behind the young man's back. Our hero felt that something had collapsed behind him. It turns out that with this light swing of his sword, Tang Dao cut through a huge stone behind them. The guy was completely shocked by what he saw. He said that it was very cool, and Tang Dao himself gave the young man the sword. The joyful guy ran to try out his new sword to the nearest tree. Having struck the tree, the sword immediately broke, and the young man made a sour face. He was clearly not happy. The guy got scared and screamed that his sword that he had just received was broken. He didn't understand what was happening. Tang Dao smiled and told our hero that the tree was alive. The guy didn't understand anything right away, but then some kind of bright green light appeared in the guy's hands and particles like leaves began to appear in the sky. He was in shock. At that moment, starting from the hilt, the blade itself began to sprout from a pile of energy leaves, and there was a green, natural aura around the sword. When the sword grew back completely, the guy was happy, grabbed it tightly, and said that even though it doesn't look like the indestructibility of an iron weapon, his sword is not bendable. Hugging and kissing his sword, Shu Yu said that this is the same as leaving the key right in front of the gate in a visible place. Tang Dao interrupted him with his cough. The swordsman reading the book said that the young man would smear the sword with his blood. The young man made a serious face and agreed to do this. The guy collected his thoughts, closed his eyes, and was about to cut his hand. Our hero did just that. The guy cut one of his palms and smeared the blood on the blade of the blade. As had already happened with the ruler, this time again a green frame with a prophecy came out in front of the young people. It said that the buds of trees with jade leaves are planted with dust, and the plants are watered with blood. The flame will ignite the will of the enemy, and the deserted city will awaken the soul of the tree. Continuing to read, Tang Dao was a little shocked. The prophecy continued saying that the lumberjack in the ranks of the rebels is fighting for friendship. The shadow of the trees in the chrysanthemum garden supports the supports. Before the eyes of thousands of people, the gates of hell will disappear, and thousands of warriors will behead the dragon, and the tall tree will become a refuge for others. Our shocked hero asked what this verse was for, to which Tang Dao, being as serious as possible, explained that this was not a verse, but a prophecy that spoke about some events from the future of Shu Yu. Tang Dao himself was shocked by some of the words. Making a stupid and uncomprehending smile, our hero asked if this could be called fortune-telling and asked the swordsman to tell him what the prophecy meant. Tang Dao smiled and said that the heavenly plan could not be revealed. In his head, the guy was replaying the words from the prophecy and did not understand anything, and he also did not understand where these words came from in his head. Closing his book, the swordsman said that in the future this might be useful to the guy, to which stupid Shu Yu picked his ears and did not understand why it might be useful to him. Tang Dao stood still and looked at the sky. He did nothing but silently think about the words from the prophecy. Closing his eyes, he plunged into memories, where before the hike he talked with his mentor. The old man asked the swordsman what sword he was giving this time for self-defense, to which Tang Dao said that it was the same sword that his uncle gave him. The old man sat down on the steps and asked what prophecy, to which Tang Dao said that a hero recognizes troubled times. Looking at the sky, the guy added that the grown tree would hold the heavens. In his memories, he also stood and looked at the sky without doing anything. The mentor lit a cigarette and smiled. He asked the student again the words where it was said that the grown sky will hold the heavens. Tang Dao walked down the steps, and the teacher laughed in his back and said that the swordsman should intervene in this troubled world. The old man went down the stairs and reasoned that since his great-grandfather founded the school of swordsmen, the time of unrest has been repeated several dozen times. The continuity has not been interrupted for thousands of years due to the fact that in this world they are only outside observers. The teacher watched as the calm Tang Dao descended the steps lower and lower. Everyone thought about his own. Tang Dao, let's say, returned from his memories to the real world because our hero turned to him. The young man appeared before Tang Dao and called him a teacher, and also asked him to teach Shu Yu how to split cobblestones. Putting his hand on his face, The swordsman said that this was a hassle and began to turn away from the guy towards his horse. Approaching his horse, Tang Dao said that they only lend swords, but do not teach them how to use them. Then the young man asked how he could master the power of this sword, to which he received a rather obvious answer. The swordsman said that when he comprehends the essence of this sword, then he will master its power. Our hero said that all this sounded very vague, and then began to run towards Tang Dao while rummaging in his pockets. The guy took out a handful of gold coins and, looking at Tang Dao with a smile, said that he would not study for nothing, and after he earned money, he would give more. Pushing the young man's coins away, Tang Dao, who had already continued reading his book, said that they, swordsmen, work at the behest of fate. The swordsman added that they cannot interfere excessively in this mortal world, and especially cannot take money. The guy was very surprised by this. The smart guy took out a book from his inner pocket and said that if Tang Dao liked books so much, then he had one very good book. Handing the book to the swordsman, the young man added that this book had recently been published, and everyone really wanted to read it. This interested Tang Dao. Taking the book in his hands and using his technique to make the book float in the air in front of him, the swordsman asked why the book was so wrinkled, and then added that the young man did not care about it at all. Tang Dao brought the book into perfect condition. This greatly surprised the young man, and he said that it was very cool, and he respected the swordsman. Opening the book to a certain page, our hero attracted the swordsman's gaze by pointing his finger at the line. Shu Yu said that it was very exciting. Tang Dao began to read that mandarin ducks cross their necks and play in the water, and phoenixes flutter from flower to flower. The swordsman did not understand what this meant. The book itself was an erotic novel, and our hero explained in his ear what the words that the swordsman had just read meant. It was about the inseparable love of a married couple, and Tang Dao himself was very embarrassed, and his face became red like a tomato. The embarrassed swordsman said that this was not bad, a rather everyday atmosphere, and the young man thought that how could it be possible not to understand what was directly said, and also suggested that Tang Dao reads books just to show off. The swordsman took the book, and the young man said that this was a gift as a greeting from the swordsman's disciple, and later he would get illustrations for him, to which Tang Dao himself said that so be it. He would teach our hero a little as an exception. The guy was glad that the swordsman accepted his gift and took him as a temporary student. Our hero fell to his knees and began to bow to Tang Dao as a sign of greeting and gratitude to his teacher. The swordsman cleared his throat and corrected the young man that he took him as a student not because of the book, but because they were connected by fate, to which the pleased boy said that the teacher was right, and they were both chubby, and that's why they got along so well. Our dissatisfied hero sat and asked when they would start, because he was too bored. At this time, Tang Dao was completely immersed in the process of reading the book that our hero gave him. He read different phrases and thought about their meaning, and the guy sat and was bored. The student continued to pester his teacher and did not allow him to read the book that interested him in peace. The swordsman said that first our hero needs to understand the nature of the sword, to which the surprised young man asked what the nature of the sword is. With a serious expression on his face, Tang Dao said that people have their own nature, and swords have their own. The swordsman continued to say that the essence of human nature is good and evil. There is evil, and there is good. This is the basis of human nature. Continuing, the guy said that gradually thousands of different human character traits developed from this basis. Taking a more serious tone, Tang Dao said that it is in the nature of the sword to kill for the sake of revenge, to kill for the sake of someone's beliefs, in order to defend these same someone's beliefs. Killing for the sake of someone's desires, seeking to complete tasks to kill someone. Kill for resources, so that the winner takes everything for himself and lives a better life, and the loser dies. And, after a short pause, Tang Dao finished, and the last thing he said was to kill in the name of ordinary people. The guy no longer had that stupid smile. He listened to his mentor with great interest and attention, and he continued saying that that's why they call him a sword. Looking at his sword, our hero said that in order to understand the nature of his sword, he needs to clearly understand what this sword is for. The mentor said that he was reasoning correctly. Tang Dao looked to the side and he called those whom he saw there annoying, and was also surprised that they were already trying to take revenge. At this moment, several arrows fly into the back of our hero. There were about 3 of them. One of the arrows caught the young man quite well, and wounded his right cheek, flying as close as possible. The other 2 missed and stuck into a tree. Screams were heard from behind, where one of the men addressed the other as Wang Lao Er and asked if he could do it. That's why he never hit. And the other answered that the young man wouldn't be able to anyway run away and told his brother not to worry. Our shocked hero hid behind a tree and was very scared. Peeking out from behind the tree, the guy began to peer to see if they were the bastards who were chasing him, and wondered how they found him so quickly. 2 men ran towards the young man. One of them was a boyaguz, and therefore tried to convince his brother that he should be more careful. But the second did not care. He ran into the gap with his sword, They say that this guy had not even dried the milk on his lips, and what is the point of being afraid of him? Our frightened hero said that he still hadn't even mastered anything, but the battle had already begun. Running away from one of the men, the young man asked Tang Dao to save him, to which the fierce man behind shouted that even God would not save him today. Gathering all his courage into a fist, the guy said that wait and see, and he himself took a fighting stance with his wooden sword. A swing of a katana flew at him. Shu Yu put a block with his wooden sword, but the sword was cut in half and wounded our hero's shoulder. Running away with his wooden sword, which had already begun to recover, he heard from the person running behind that the young man would not be able to do anything to him with a wooden sword. From a tree sprouted on the ground and he fell over it. At that moment, the man wanted to hit the young man on the back, but he was able to dodge by reacting. Having taken the right position and counterattacked his opponent, our hero was still able to inflict at least some damage to his opponent. But due to the fact that the sword was wooden, the damage was insignificant. The man who was hit with a wooden sword shouted that it hurt, and the young man himself began to run towards Tang Dao and shout that if he did not get up, but continued to sit like an idol, he would lose his only and beloved student. But the swordsman himself did not pay attention on our hero. One of the warriors realized that he was too self-confident and thought that if our hero's sword was real, then his hand would have been crippled, and also thought that it seemed like the sword was broken. Tang Dao was more and more drawn into his new book. Turning his head to the running student, he decided to ask the meaning of some words. But the screaming guy asked the mentor to look around and asked how he could still leaf through books. Our smart hero guessed that it would be safest to sit next to the teacher. Do you think he was right? Of course, yes. One of the soldiers ran up to both guys and shouted that he would kill both. But at that moment something happened. Up that! Instead of a huge sword, the man held a small twig and looked with complete shock and anger on his face. The soldier did not understand what had happened, and at that moment Tang Dao, who was reading a book and held the soldier's sword in 2 fingers, the young man was glad that his teacher had finally begun to act. Tang Dao threw the caught sword towards the soldier from whom he took the same sword. The sword pierced directly into the stone a few centimeters from the head of that same soldier. Tang Dao said that our hero needs to decide for himself whether to capture the soldier or kill him, to which the surprised guy began to ask questions. Putting on a rude tone and an angry face, the swordsman said not to distract him while he read. The stone in which the sword was suddenly exploded, and then one of the soldiers stood in complete shock just like our hero. While fleeing, the soldiers realized that this was no longer something they could handle, and therefore, leaving behind clouds of smoke, they ran away. Having gone not far, one of the soldiers suggested stopping. A brilliant plan appeared in his head. The soldier who was with the sword noticed that Tang Dao would not attack them as long as they did not interfere with him. Taking another sword, the man said that risk is a noble cause and went to meet our hero. The swordsman said that he would distract that bastard and ordered his brother to find a way to attack him. Our hero leaned on Tang Dao's back and bandaged the wound that was on his shoulder during the unsuccessful block. The swordsman approached the young man and said that it was better for the boy to just give up, and then perhaps the soldier could help make sure his punishment was commuted. Our hero had never heard such nonsense before. He asked if he looked like an idiot and began to cover the newly bandaged wound with his hand. The young man understood that while he was hiding near Tang Dao, here they would not dare to do anything. Suddenly, the guy notices how the arrowhead shines from the bushes and focuses his attention on it. The guy noticed the ambush in time, and so he simply rolled to the other side and hid behind Tang Dao. Teasing the archer, the guy said that they would not be able to ambush him, and if they wanted to catch him, then let his teachers defeat him first. The archer tried to shoot at the guy several times, but it was all to no avail. He never hit the young man. Tang Dao began to get annoyed by the student's constant flashing before his eyes, as well as his comments after each dodge. Having said this out loud, the swordsman jumped onto a tree so that no one would disturb him, and the surprised young man remained on the ground. Our hero suddenly began to be surrounded by soldiers from both sides, and the teacher did not care at all. He sat high on a tree and enjoyed reading a book. Shouting that this was their chance, the soldier with the sword ran towards the guy, swinging his katana. At that moment, the young man said that the matter was rubbish and did not know how to get out of such a situation. On the other hand, the archer pulled his bow, smiling, saying that now they will see how Shu Yu dodges. On one side and arrows on the other, the guy is lightning fast, and Masterpiece dodged every attack of his enemies. Due to the mistakes of both of them, the soldiers began to start a quarrel between each other, where the archer almost hit his ally at moments. A strong man with a sword ordered his comrade to use the sword, and they ran together after our hero, and the young man himself asked in shock whether Tang Dao would help him. The selfish Tang Dao said that if the guy can't handle even such a small problem, then how is he even going to fight huge monsters in the future? The angry student thought that he shouldn't have given the book to his mentor and continued to run. During his escape from the guards, the guy kept trying to understand what his sword was for and how to use it correctly. The guy was driven by animal instincts, and he wanted only one thing: to survive. Approaching, one of the swordsmen said, swinging his sword and shouting that the young man had committed a serious crime. Our hero was able to block the blow with his wooden sword, and, to the surprise of everyone who was there, did not even break. Holding the block stubbornly, Shuyu thought that the purpose for which he was holding this sword was survival. Hesitating and paying attention to extraneous thoughts, the wooden sword cracked, and the soldier shouted that they were just commoners who led a miserable existence. Breaking the wooden sword again, the warrior asked whether the young man thought he was worthy to compare himself with them. The shocked guy again could not understand why his sword broke, because just now everything was fine. Tang Dao watched this battle from a tree, and he said that it was really difficult for this child to comprehend the grandiose plan behind the wooden sword. That was his problem. The guy's sword was broken again, and the guy himself had already been seriously wounded twice with a katana. He thought that he needed a new plan. At that moment, the guy's eyes darkened and he felt some kind of severe pain in his chest. The guy lost all his strength. It turns out that while the guy hesitated, the second soldier came up from behind and stabbed our hero right in the center of his chest with his sword and shouted that he had succeeded. The guy started bleeding from his mouth. All emotion disappeared from his face, and the young man himself quickly began to fall to the ground. Pulling the sword from our hero's chest, the warrior kicked him on the back and he immediately fell. The wound was very deep and Shuyu himself lost a lot of blood. He lay and did not move. There was a huge pool of blood under him, and the guy himself was holding a piece of his wooden sword in his hands. An angry guard stood on the body of our hero and shouted that he had wasted his body in vain. Our hero looked at the face of this warrior and remembered his childhood, when another noble was proud and arrogant towards them and looked down on them. In his memories, the young man remembered how he stood in the market with his father, and they were scolded by one of the officials saying that Shu Yuya's father has no right to make so much tofu, because they don't buy his tofu anymore. As a little boy, our young hero observed this whole picture and not yet understanding how this world works. He felt very sorry for his father and offended by such an act on the part of the nobles. Shu Yu ran up to the man who was yelling at his father and punched him in the stomach, calling him an idiot and trying to make him pay for their tofu. Not looking at the fact that it was a small child, the official kicked him and told him to get lost. Then the father, saving his son from falling, catches him and hits the official in the nose, so much so that from the very first blow, a fountain of blood comes from him. The boy wanted to help his father, but his father sent him home as soon as possible in order to protect him from trouble. Having shown his son that everything was fine, the man said that dad would sort everything out and let him run away. Shu Yu listened to his father and did not get in the way. The boy ran away with all his might, asking his father only one thing: to be careful. When the son left, the man made a rude expression on his face and looked at his opponent as if with the grin of a wild animal. The city police saw all this, and therefore, because some peasant dared to attack people, our hero's father received 50 lashes as punishment. It seemed that there was no living space left on the man, but he was alive, and he understood that he had to return to his son, and therefore did not give up. The man entered the house, and his little son met him. He was happy about his father's return, and also said that he had prepared dinner. His father praised him. The worried boy saw a lot of blood and asked if his father had lost, and the father, so that his son would not consider him weak, said that it was impossible. There was so much blood because he was carrying a pig for Uncle Fan. However, the guy, barely holding back his tears, looked at his father with a sad look and realized that he was lying. Putting on a serious face, our hero said firmly and unconditionally that he would go to school and gain knowledge. However, the man looked sad and said that they could not go to school or gain recognition. Not understanding his father, Shu Yu said that if his dad was worried about payment, he would work hard and together they would save enough. The father took a short pause and said that it was not about the money, but about the rules. While stuffing his mouth with food, our little hero asked what other rules were and why not. Out of anger, the man, realizing that he could not give his son what he wanted to achieve or somehow support in his endeavors, he broke his chopsticks and said that according to the rules, peasants cannot study. The father explained that all these higher levels hope that you will forever be a peasant and that your children and your grandchildren will be peasants, so that they can always be above them. The upset boy, having lost faith in his dream and goal, asked if they could do something. However, his father patted him on the head and said that if he wanted to study, then he still had hope. Having finished thinking about his father and their long-standing gathering, Shu Yu lay exhausted on the ground with a huge loss of blood. His sword sprouted next to him. With the last of his strength, our hero grabbed his sword and remembered the words of his father who said that his mother taught him to read, and he would teach his son. The guards were very surprised that the young man was still alive, and one of them, standing over the body, the boy was preparing to strike another very strong and deep blow with his sword. But in an instant, the boy's face became much more serious. After his memories, it was as if he had regained his strength. Our hero's sword began to emit some kind of green aura, which approached his enemies. The guy stood up, looking at how the elements of his sword attacked his enemies. The guy firmly decided that he would gather a group of like-minded people so that he could never, ever be offended again. In front of our hero stood wounded soldiers who helped each other get up, while Shu Yu himself stood and did not move. At this time it was already evening and Tang Dao was sitting nearby, frying fish over a fire. The swordsman said that the seed of the tree of longevity had already sprouted, and spring and autumn would last forever. He closely watched his student. Our hero stood as if he had matured 10 years ahead. Some seeds were flying around him in the air, and the sword itself glowed with a green aura. The teacher said that the guy had learned something after all. The frightened archer said that that master began to move, and therefore he suggested that they leave quickly. But the enraged warrior with the sword did not want to retreat. He said that he did not care, and was preparing to run towards the enemy. The guy closed his eyes and prepared to cross swords as if he were a blind kenjutsu master. Our hero's enemy ran up and swung, but Shu Yu himself turned out to be faster, and he hit him on the chest with his beautiful sword, causing some kind of vine to appear on the enemy's hands and sword. Having wounded his opponent quite well, the young man said that they should go to hell with their division into scientists, nobles, commoners, and slaves. The guy arrogantly looked at the lying enemy and said that what was stratified into people occupying a high position and the common people would not wait. The second soldier, a frightened archer, screamed at the top of his voice. He was trembling with fear because his friend had just been defeated by just some commoner. He turned around and began to run away, shouting throughout the forest and calling for someone to help. But our hero did not run after him. With just one glance, Shu Yu looked at the fleeing enemy, and at that very second, some kind of vine flew after him. The guy watched this spectacle intently, how the vine was tearing apart the body of his opponent and did not take his eyes off him. It was already late at night. The exhausted, wounded guy approached the fire where Tang Dao was sitting and reading his book. Approaching the mentor, our hero said that he had dealt with them, to which the swordsman smiled and praised the student. Tang Dao handed the fish fried on a stick to his student and told him to eat, and also added that tomorrow he would teach him a few techniques. Tang Dao looked at the guy and realized that now was not the time to teach him anything. The exhausted and wounded young man passed out leaning on a stone. The swordsman said that the wounds were quite serious. Then, with one gesture, Tang Dao opened his sword case and the sword he needed flew out of it. It was a sword with a turquoise glow. It seemed that it had an ear of wheat instead of a blade. Tang Dao made another swing of his hand and pointed the sword closer to the student. The sword began to crumble on the petal and each petal entered the guy's body, healing him. Meanwhile, at the Yuanzhou Dynasty Imperial Astronomical Observatory, a man stood on a huge circle with different symbols and tried to understand something with a frightened look. Being frightened by something, the man could not believe his eyes and opened his mouth in surprise. He stood in front of a huge structure and said that the Emperor's aura was increasing. The radiance of the heavenly bodies had changed, and also added that there would be a sudden clap of thunder. The guy from the observatory immediately forced the horses to be prepared because he urgently needed to meet with His Majesty. And in the meantime, His Majesty himself had 3 guys on his knees and asked to give them a few more days to catch the rebel. The evil ruler sighed and said that these people were a bunch of useless drunkards. He ordered them to be thrown out and cut into pieces. The soldiers began to take the servants out into the street, and they begged to spare them. The ruler's right hand said that they would immediately recruit new people. From the entrance, towards where the emperor was sitting, some unidentified object was flying. The advisor began to cover His Majesty with his body and shouted that everyone would protect him in the same way. The same golden sword that Tang Dao gave to this ruler flew into the back of the throne. The ruler was not touched by the sword. However, the man got angry and said that it was that devilish sword again, and pulled it out from the back of the throne. The ruler was indignant that this sword was returning for the 3rd time, and he remembered exactly that the last time he buried it in a deep well, all the guards and servants around were scared. The emperor threw the sword to the ground and ordered his servants to melt it immediately. Preparations began on the street to carry out His Majesty's order. The emperor and his advisor stood not far from the place where this sword was melted and watched the process of carrying out the order. However, the sword became covered with a green aura and flew out of the cauldron in which the melting took place. The sword flew into the sky and everyone began to watch this spectacle, as if the sword was consuming fire. The even more angry emperor was surprised that this devilish sword absorbed fire, and the advisor thought it was incredible. Then the ruler ordered the destruction of the sword, and soon on the street the sword was tied to chains and hung in the air, and 3 cannons were brought up to it, with 2 soldiers behind each cannon. By order of the commander-in-chief, the cannons were fired. 3 cannonballs flew at the sword, but the sword was again covered with a green aura, and all the chains were broken. It felt like an invisible protective field appeared around the sword, into which the cannonballs flew in and didn't even touch the sword itself. The advisor shouted that this devilish sword was too strange and ordered to continue firing, while the emperor silently watched this spectacle. The emperor smiled and an idea appeared in his head, so he began to slowly walk forward. The advisor at that moment ordered a ceasefire, and the emperor silently walked towards the sword. The emperor picked up the sword and said that no guns would help against divine artifacts. The servants began to congratulate their ruler. The man who was in the observatory ran to meet the emperor and shouted that great trouble was overtaking them. The emperor's advisor ridiculed the deputy head of the Imperial Astronomical Observatory for behaving inappropriately in such a situation. But the deputy himself ran as best he could to the emperor and greeted him. Bowing, the man said that he was watching the night sky and discovered. The man was so excited that he could not finish speaking properly. The emperor immediately ordered the man to finish. The man calmed down and said that he discovered that the emperor's aura had increased in the southeast. The ruler's face changed instantly and he was afraid of something. It was impossible to read on his face whether he was afraid or angry, but one could definitely say that he was dissatisfied with this news. The deputy became even more agitated when the ruler pointed his sword at him. The man said that he would definitely find these criminals and destroy them. The ruler ordered that the man destroy the family of these criminals down to the 9th generation. Turning away, the emperor walked up to the fence and began to look down on the city, while his deputy and servants sat on their knees behind him. With a strong swing of his sword, the emperor said that his empire would last forever. After this strong wave, the emperor was covered with a green aura, and a whale-like silhouette appeared in the sky, and the wind rose around him. A green whale from the energy of the emperor's sword began to fly around the city and fly over every building. People and children around admired or were shocked by what they saw. When would they have the opportunity to look at the energy animal in the sky? The emperor stood and did not know what to do. There was still green energy around him. Meanwhile, in the forest, our hero was sleeping and gaining strength when a red snake began to climb onto his stomach. The guy woke up and the first thing he saw before his eyes was a snake sitting on his chest in front of his face. Of course, our hero got scared. Who wouldn't be scared of a snake in such a situation? The young man jumped up and threw the snake off of him. The snake flew towards Tang Dao and Shu Yu shouted to him about it. The swordsman at that time was sitting on his animal and reading a book. The guy did some kind of technique and a purple aura appeared around him. But at the same time, Tang Dao himself did not move and continued reading the book. The swordsman ordered our hero not to throw garbage, pointing at the snake. Tang Dao said that this brought back memories for him, and the frightened young man and the horse ran away from the snake. The swordsman began to use his technique on the snake, and it all turned gray, and purple energy flowed through its veins. Our hero watched this spectacle, and the swordsman added that this time she would now be the young man's rival. Instantly the snake became huge, dozens of times larger than a person. It became white and its eyes glowed red, like 2 rubies. The guy was completely shocked by what he saw, although anyone would be surprised by such a creature. Our hero could not stand it and vomited. He fell to the ground and was foaming at the mouth. Tang Dao looked at the stony-faced guy while reading his book. The swordsman used his technique on our hero, and he immediately woke up in front of a huge snake. The snake opened its mouth and wanted to fly at our hero, but he simply screamed and called for help. A huge snake was crawling after the guy, and he was using some strange sayings about croton seeds while running away from it. The snake destroyed everything in its path, crashing into every tree due to its huge size. And the young man said that Tang Dao was just trying to finish him off, without even letting him say a word. The swordsman ordered the snake to silence the young man and continued reading his book. The snake hit the guy with its head, and the guy himself flew up and said that he was wrong and would not say anything more. Tang Dao told our hero to remember how he dealt with those 2 opponents yesterday. The guy stopped and began replay in your head yesterday's fight and remember everything down to the smallest details. The guy did hooked and hit Snake with his sword with green aura. Snake hissed in pain. The technique with which yesterday the guy defeated his enemies began to fly at her. The green vine flew towards the snake's head. Our hero's technique knocked the snake to the ground and chained it to the ground with a vine, even tying its mouth so that it wouldn't bite anyone or make sounds. Rejoicing, the guy asked if this was the true power of the sword, but something went wrong. The snake was able to get out of its natural bonds and opened its mouth. Next, with her body, she was able to break the vine that was holding her back and chaining her to the ground. The snake became even more angry. Its red eyes began to glow brighter with anger. The snake began to chase the guy again, and the running guy asked if the sword's power was too weak. While reading the book, Tang Dao began to say that trees without roots are like duckweed. If our hero wants to withstand the strong wind, he must have strong roots. The swordsman continued to say that only by having roots can you sprout, grow branches and leaves, and then one tree becomes the beginning of an entire forest. This is the way of the trees. Our hero realized that Zheng is also part of the tree, and so he began to move the blade of the sword along the ground. Using the ground, the guy made a circular kick and said that in order to take root, soil is needed. He was determined and confident. The magical paths again began to restrain the snake, but even in appearance, these bonds were already much stronger and stronger than the previous ones. The guy fell and grabbed the ground with his hands. he said that he suddenly lost all his strength. And at that moment, the snake was able to break the bonds of our hero again and hit him, throwing him back a decent distance. Tang Dao was reading his book, and our hero flew several meters away and crashed into a tree. Our hero hit his back against a tree and fell face first into the ground. The swordsman was a little confused that the guy could not withstand more than a couple of blows. Our hero, weakly leaning on his sword, gets up and does not give up. Tang Dao tells him to thrust the sword into the tree. The guy put his sword into the tree with all his might, and then some miracle happened. What happened? But what? Our hero began to feed the life energy of the tree and recover. The guy, fully recovered and full of strength, he asked what happened. Tang Dao explained to the young man that the 2 attacks he used had completely depleted his qi. The confused guy asked what qi was, and then Tang Dao began a short lecture. The swordsman began to explain that qi energy and fate, where energy determines whether a person will be strong or weak, and fate is how this energy will manifest itself in life, are in harmony in the human body. The swordsman also added that once the hero will understand the purpose of the blade, it will begin to act, becoming his main strength. Tang Dao told the young man that he was of low birth, and therefore his qi energy was naturally weak. The guy turned away and got a little angry, saying that this was the fate again and there was no way to get rid of it. The swordsman turned to the young man, smiled, and said that fate was determined by the heavens. Our hero did not fully understand the words of his mentor, but Tang Dao continued that luck depends on ourselves. Looking at the guy, he said that his path will be full of trials. He wishes the young man to become as persistent as his sword. Zheng. The guy smiled, raised his sword, and said that this student understood everything, and in the worst case, during battles he would look for trees. The guy made a menacing face and said that he needed to finish the matter with the snake. Having run up, he screamed and ran towards the snake at breakneck speed, and the snake did the same. There was a battle in the forest. All the birds that were sitting in the trees began to fly away from the mess that was taking place there. After a long battle, our hero still manages to defeat his opponent. He jumped on the head of this huge snake and inserted the sword right into the center of the head. The guy jumped off. Because of the huge cloud of dust, neither the snake nor the young man himself were visible. When the dust settled on the ground, our hero saw that the magic had dissipated, and the snake had turned into the small one it was before the transformation. Exhaling heavily, the tired guy said that he had finally defeated this snake. Tang Dao opened the case and put this snake in there, and also told our hero that the spirit of the sword had not yet awakened. The swordsman gathered himself and said that their teacher-student relationship had come to an end, and he would lend our hero this blade. Shu Yu bowed and thanked his mentor for everything, who, although he had not taught him for a long time, taught him a lot. The guy shouted after the departing Tang Dao that he would teach him some more powerful techniques in the future, to which the swordsman said that he would teach him if it was so destined by fate. Then the young man promised to bring his mentor plum flowers in a golden vase with illustrations. The guy walked along the road out of the forest and thought about his father and Ye Luo. Drawing attention to his dirty clothes covered in blood, Shu Yu said that he needed to wash his clothes. Otherwise, he simply would not be allowed into the village. While running along the next path, the guy noticed that he had left some kind of purple zone and realized that it was a barrier. Our hero realized that the teacher created the barrier so that wild animals would not come to them and disturb them. Approaching the city, the young man saw 3 guards standing at the gate, checking each person. The guy realized that they were still looking for him, and we will find out what happened next in the following chapters. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Subscribe. Dabo Recap with Love.